All right, well, I'll continue to let people in, but for the sake of time, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. And yeah, if you're able to share this live, feel free to. We're also going to record this and have it available for sharing afterwards as well. We appreciate all of you making time in your schedule today to join us. The workshop is titled Seagrapes and Biodiversity, and we're glad to have you here. My name is Cara Abbott. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Institute for Regional Conservation, and I'll be moderating. So George, if you can take us to the next slide, I will kind of go over how today will work. So we're going to have presentations from each of our panelists. I'll give them a quick introduction in a minute. And then at the end, we'll open it up for a Q&A session. So how this will work, we have that chat function on Zoom. So as you have questions, we go throughout the presentation, feel free to type it into the chat. And then at the end, I'm kind of going to work back and go through those. When you type in your question, you can either specifically address a panelist or just ask it open-ended and we'll get a panelist who's a good fit for answering it. We do have a tight schedule to get all of this done in an hour. We're going to do our best to stick to this, but just know we might end up running a little bit late. We will record this and post it later if you are on a strict schedule and need to leave at 1. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists that we have today. Our first is George Gann. So George is the founder and chief conservation strategist of IRC. He has 40 years experience in coastal conservation and restoration, and he's the lead author of the peer-reviewed International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. George, can you wave to show everybody who you are? There's George. Next up, we'll have Niki Desjardin. She's the Director of Operations at Ecological Associates, Inc. in Jensen Beach, Florida. She has her master's degree in biology from Florida Atlantic University and has worked with sea turtles in South Florida for the last 20 years. Niki's focus at EAI is the evaluation of impacts to sea turtles and shorebirds from coastal construction projects like beach nourishment and dune restoration. And Niki, can you point us out? Hi, Niki. Next up, we will have Rob and Mike. I have a little bio for Rob here. Rob Barron is a biologist, nursery owner and landscaper who has been restoring coastal dunes in Florida and the Caribbean since 1977, including over 2,000 projects and more than 80 miles of shoreline. And our last panelist for today is Jimmy Lange. Jimmy is a botanist with the South Florida Conservation Program at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden and a research associate of IRC. He has spent most of the last decade studying plant ecology and conservation in Florida and currently oversees a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funded project to restore Jacomania reclinata habitat throughout its historical range. And we're going to get to hear a little bit about that today. So Jimmy, if you can wave to everybody. Awesome. So if you are not a panelist, I'm going to ask that you turn your camera off for now, and I can go through and do that in a minute. But it's easier if you can just do that for me. That way, hopefully, the way the recording works, we'll have just the videos of the panelists off to the side. So again, feel free to type questions into the chat as they come up. We will get those addressed at the end, and we'll also open it up for questions at the end. But thanks for being here today. We hope this is going to be insightful for everyone. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker today, which is George Gann.
Great, thanks, Cara. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being here. So I'm going to start off giving a little bit of an introduction to the topic and about IRC and our programs titled Seagrape Trimming, Ecological Restoration and Coastal Conservation, Biodiversity Restoration and Community Engagement in Southeastern Florida. And so I will be focusing on the work that we're doing currently in Southeastern Palm Beach County, but I've noticed some people from other parts, and this topic is perfectly good from Key Biscayne and Miami-Dade County to much further to the north. I want to start off with some acknowledgements and just state that all the work that we do is collaborative and that many people have contributed. over a long period of time. Thank the photographers who provide us with great imagery for our websites and our presentations, and then the many Restoring the Gold Coast sponsors and collaborators. And thanks a lot to Nikki and Rob and Mike and Jimmy for being here today. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to talk about IRC and our mission, our Restoring the Gold Coast program, the issue of Seagrapes and biodiversity, and then a short kind of context of ecological restoration and how we think about this issue. So IRC has been around for about 35 years. We've been pretty active in South Florida for the last 25. And we have a pretty broad program, but our focus really is on preventing local extinctions of native plants and animals and the restoration of native ecosystems. We have a pretty broad program, and you can check that out online, and you'll see some of that here today. One of our important programs is our ecological restoration program, and we do that together with our community outreach, which Cara heads up. And the idea is, you know, we have a professional restoration crew, but our thinking is that we really need to engage the public and get support for our projects if they are to be successful. We do a lot of research, especially floristics and things about native plants, and we try to package that information in ways that people can make use of them. So there's different kinds of material available on the Floristic Inventory of South Florida or Natives to Your Neighborhood. We've produced written guides and all kinds of stuff. So I encourage you to check that stuff out. For IRC, local biodiversity matters. So some people are concerned about, you know, whether something is rare in Latin America or in New England or whatever, but we really think that we have a really cool flora and fauna in South Florida, and so we're interested in what can we do to really protect all or as many species as possible in South Florida. And this is just an example of one suite of species that a rare species growing in hardwood hammocks in Everglades National Park. Somebody has their mic on. If you could turn that off, that would be really great. The conservation context is that South Florida is part of the North American coastal plain global hotspot. So that means we have a lot of endemic species, but also a lot of imperilment. We have a really unique assemblage of tropical, temperate, and widespread species in South Florida. And here's just a couple of examples of Florida endemics. The one on the left, Agave decipiens, that you can see on the dunes in southeastern Florida, is a little bit more widespread. And then the beach cluster vine, Giacomonia, that Jimmy will talk about, with a more restricted range. We have a great conservation system in South Florida, and in theory, everything should be great. We have way more than the global target, but our conservation system really focuses on wetlands in the interior, and so there's certain ecosystems that are very poorly protected, and coastal strands, some other of the coastal uplands, are part of that gap. Plant diversity is the key to animal biodiversity. Without plants, we don't have animals, whether that's invertebrates like butterflies and cicadas, but also birds and all other mammals. And of course, without animals, we don't have pollinators, we don't have plants, we don't have dispersers, etc. Okay, in 2015, we conducted a survey and assessment of Delray, both Atlantic Dunes Park and Delray Municipal Beach. So this was part of a management program that Rob Barron was working on for the city of Delray Beach, in which we recorded all of the species and all of the dune walkover segments. And we recorded 101 native dune species. That's a really high number. There's equal extent of beach you could walk on in South Florida and get far fewer species. There were 7 species that were previously recorded that we didn't document. And then we also looked at the historical literature and developed a list of 75 species that were within native range that were missing. So there were still many species, as well as Delray was doing, there were still many species that were missing. And we became interested in whether we could create a program to bring those back. We were also concerned about invasive species and documented where those were, and then also about the expanding sea grapes, which were due to be trimmed at Delray Municipal Beach at the time. We put together a proposal for Impact 100 and were awarded the environment category in 2019 in the spring. For our Restoring the Gold Coast program. We built a really robust program with many collaborators and sponsors, and importantly, because this topic of sea grapes and sea grape trimming is a hot button item, I want to just everybody read the disclaimer at the bottom. The views expressed in this presentation are IRCs and our collaborators and who are present and presenting, and not necessarily those of anybody else. Our goals for Restoring the Gold Coast in Southern Palm Beach County are to conduct outreach to municipalities and community groups, to assess the coastal plant diversity and loss, to conduct hands-on restoration and education events and workshops, to increase depleted populations of native plants, and to engage public officials and other influencers to try and improve the conservation and restoration of coastal biodiversity. We've conducted rapid assessments of many miles of beach. This is the first one we did in 2019 in collaboration with the city of, or the town of Ocean Ridge. We've identified opportunities where biodiversity restoration could occur, and there's all kinds of different circumstances where that can happen. We've held dozens of workshops and lectures and field events throughout Southern Palm Beach County. And to date, we've outplanted about 50 species of depleted native plants that were historically found in greater abundance in the area, including some that had been extirpated, and we're continuing to add to that mix. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the kind of biodiversity that, that we're bringing back. We've produced resources for private dune owners because throughout much of southeastern Florida, private owners, whether they're just individual homeowners or large condo associations, are critically important to management of dunes. So we want to try and improve the resources that are available to them, and so they understand the issue and can do something about it. And one example of that are these biodiversity starter plant kits, and in this case, creating kits of larval and nectar plants for coastal butterflies so that we can improve habitat for those species. All right, so we're going to dive into the topic of sea grapes and biodiversity and the coastal strand conundrum. So the background really quickly is, where did the native biodiversity go? It either went under cement and houses and parking lots or into the sea. So this is a typical image, thanks to Rob Barron for this one, from around 1970. And this was a typical situation throughout much of southeastern Florida during that period. What have we done well? We've done a lot well. We've learned how to move sand around and re-nourish the beaches. We've learned to plant sea oats and a few other species. And we've learned to recover sea turtles. Some key coastal forests have been protected, like at Ocean Ridge Hammock Park, the old Boynton Hammock, and also at Gumbo Limbo Nature Center, the old Boca Hammock and Red Reef. The Delray Dune has recovered very nicely, as we mentioned. It's loaded with rare plants, but those are especially in the grassy areas and areas that have not been overtaken by sea grapes. However, coastal strand, or the shrub zone, has been heavily impacted and has not been restored with consistency or at scale. So coastal strand, this is the shrubby community dominated by saw palmettos and tropical and temperate shrubs and vines and grasses and all kinds of different species, is the area where a lot of the coastal biodiversity was historically. Throughout the state, coastal strand is ranked as imperiled in Florida by the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, and if we were to rank that regionally, it would have to be ranked as critically imperiled, with way less than 5% remaining south of North Palm Beach. So this is a historical photo. This is from the Delray Beach City Hall. This is what the coastline used to look like. So there are no trees. This is typical. Sea grapes are native to this ecosystem, so we can just dispense with that conversation. It is a native plant. It's native to the coastal system. It's well adapted to it, and that's one of the issues. But it was not dominant or even abundant in most parts of the coastal system. Rob Barron has done a really fabulous job compiling a bunch of historical photographs. You can see these on his presentation he did for the Florida Association of Native Nurseries. And I encourage you to go and take a look at that, that website, or that slideshow. Rob's going to show some other things from that, but but check it out. It's really pretty cool. But you can see again, it's open, it's grassy, it's palmy, it's shrubby, it's not a forest. So what's happened over time is that our perception of what the system used to look like has shifted as people have built houses and condos and planted trees and so forth. And so this is, on the left, is a stylized dune profile. And it's, it's used for an educational purpose to talk about maritime forests, but it really exemplifies this kind of, mental construct of what people have. And you can see that even the grassy pioneer zone is squeezed down to a tiny little area. There's basically no coastal strand. There's no saw palmetto, and there's seagrape on the east face and a big forest. And on the right is the actual footprint of coastal strand. This is Dan Austin et al., 1977. And you can see the white area in the middle is the extent of the coastal strand. So this was, in most places, well over half of the coastal upland was coastal strand. This vast shrubland of saw palmetto and other plants. So what's happened over time is the sea grapes have grown and have been planted and such, and trees, or I put that in quotes, trees in the wrong place destroy native biodiversity. You'll see some examples of this in a little bit. But these sea grape stands that we see now are artifacts of human actions, and they are certainly not maritime hammocks, which are very diverse forests that are further to the west. What's happened over time is that sea grapes have moved to the east, and the human impact along the beach is very high, and so you kind of see this whole diverse, both the front dune and the coastal strand being squeezed into smaller and smaller areas. There are some areas where, like the Delray Municipal Beach, where there's much more grassy area, but this is a common sight throughout southeastern Florida. The bottom line is the last remnants of coastal strand are being overwhelmed and destroyed primarily by a combination of sea grapes and invasive species. So you can see the slide on the left. You can see this saw palmetto is barely sticking out, surrounded by sea grapes and scaevola, and if not attended to, will be dead in the matter of a few years. And on the right, these are skeletons of saw palmettos that were unearthed when we did some Brazilian pepper removal within the sea grape forest at Atlantic Dunes Park. And just to give some people a perspective, we understand we want to protect trees, but one of the reasons people want to do that is because they're theoretically old. But these saw palmetto clumps have been aged to be in the hundreds or thousands of years old. These are ancient organisms that are dying because we're not attending to the issues at hand. So I wanted to talk for a moment about the causes of sea grape expansion. What's happening with the sea grapes? Why are they so much more abundant and so forth? And there's many reasons that I've just compiled this preliminary list. Happy to have other suggestions or comments, but the first is planting. We planted lots and lots of sea grapes. The lack of fire. Indigenous burning was important to coastal strand historically. People have not really paid a lot of attention to this. But in this particular case, unlike in scrub or in flatwoods, the loss of indigenous burning has not been followed by prescribed burning. We've had fewer freezes. We're seeing competition for light, where Brazilian pepper and other exotics in the interior are causing sea grapes to grow taller. We're seeing nutrification, where we know that nutrients are coming in from surrounding landscapes or even from dune plantings. Maybe that's having a role, adding to the problem. In changing wind dynamics, we're seeing very interesting things going on with wind. So when we remove some of these exotics on the foredune, the sea grapes are frying back in response to the wind. But we know that fire is super important and something that we probably should talk about. If we're not going to burn, then we have to have fire analog activities or surrogate activities. All right, to close up my part, I'm going to talk about ecological restoration very briefly in terms of how we think about it. We're doing our work within the concept of the 8 principles of the international principles and standards for the practice of ecological restoration that I am a co-author of. And one of the first things in terms of the issue of restoration is that we have to engage stakeholders. That's what we're doing here. And there are many stakeholder issues. from ocean views, property rights, turtles and lights, biodiversity conservation, erosion protection, storm protection, recreation, invasive species permitting and maintenance. So it's a complex topic, and we have to attend to all of those issues when we think about doing this restoration. We want to be informed by reference sites. So there are actually sites out there that we can look at and see what would the system possibly be. We also have the historical photographs and plant lists and all kinds of other information that can go into our thinking. We can use this information to design our restoration programs and respond to change, like bringing the coastal strand a little bit further to the east into the grassy dune. I want to point out the ecological recovery wheel and the standards and how this really causes us to think about the entire ecosystem. So we don't want to just think about plants, that's my thing, but I also have to think about turtles, I have to think about water, I have to think about all kinds of things when doing restoration. We want to have a balanced approach to this problem. So for instance, we know that we have excellent opportunities for restoration and connectivity in coastal uplands, but we also have conflicts. So we have issues with turtles and turtle lighting, about roads next to beaches and renourishment, all kinds of things that are impacting some species in the system, and we have to be mindful of this. This is critically important. We can't just concentrate on the part that we're interested in and not pay attention to this part. And then the ecological, the restorative continuum, the idea is that in some places we can do a full recovery, ecological restoration. In other areas we can do other kinds of activities, but it's the cumulative effect of all of these different activities that really matter. All right, so now we're going to switch to Niki. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, and Niki, you are up.
Okay, just a second. Sorry, I'm just having a difficulty here. See if this works. Can you see my PowerPoint here? That's a yes? Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Good.
Okay, very good. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this workshop, George and Cara. As you said, I bring a perspective from the monitoring of beach nourishment and coastal lighting from my work at EAI. And my firm does have a long history of doing that. We've been monitoring beaches for these types of impacts to turtles for the past 25 years and have done a lot of work with coastal lighting evaluations. And so essentially, I just hope to bring some light to the behavior of sea turtles on the beach. They are incredibly complex in the way that we've learned that they navigate and orient, and some people have actually made this their life's work. So there's a lot to be said there. I'm going to briefly introduce some nesting trends from the state of Florida over the last 30 some odd years and tell you a little bit about the main threats to turtles, and then close up with talking about the role that sea turtles play in coastal ecosystem management and then how sea grapes fit into that. So I'm sure this is not news to most of you on this call. Sea turtle biology is very widely known here in Florida, but if you don't know, sea turtles emerge from their nests at night, pretty much triggered by a cue to do that when the temperature drops. And so they come out as a group together, and hopefully if things go well, they will crawl down towards the ocean. And they use several cues once they emerge from their nest to help them do that. Because you think about it, they've been in an egg for their entire lives, and they come out onto the beach and they have to be sure that they're crawling the right direction. And so they're relying on environmental cues to ensure that they're making it to the water's edge. And the main cue that they're using to orient to the water is a tall dune horizon, or a taller, darker horizon. So studies have found that hatchlings will crawl away from a taller, darker horizon to a lower, brighter horizon. And when they reach the water, they're using other cues to help them swim offshore, namely wave orientation cues that help them to exit the predator-rich coastal environment and move offshore. So I wanted to introduce just a really simplified schematic of a cross-section of a beach. So the top one is a nourished beach, and the bottom one is more of a natural beach. And I'm doing this just to illustrate the basically the view of what a turtle sees when they crawl up the beach. So in the top image, from left to right, we're seeing what it would be a building with some dunes, dune vegetation, and then moving out across the nourished beach, which is that speckled area, and then down into the water. On a nourished beach, the berm is built to be very wide and flat, and it has a very steep foreshore slope. On a natural beach, we're seeing a much more narrow berm and a much more gradual slope up to the dune. So the red arrow is representing what a turtle would see when they crawl up onto the beach. And essentially, on a nourished beach, a turtle would be presented with an unobstructed view of the nighttime sky. So that could be natural light, reflected light coming from behind, from the moon or whatever, but it could also be from artificial lights. On a natural beach, on a more gradual slope, a turtle would be presented with a tall, dark silhouette of the dune, which would be blocking lights from behind. And so just quickly, I wanted to share with you some of the nesting trends we've been seeing in Florida. The next three graphs I'll be presenting are the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Index Nesting Beach Survey data, which is a standardized data collection program, and they can use these data to analyze trends. So this is the loggerhead nesting trend since 1989. Loggerheads are the most numerous nesting in Florida, and they're considered a threatened species. You can see on the y-axis here, 70,000 nests is the top number here. And over time, we've had some increases, some decreases, but overall, it's a slightly positive trend, hovering somewhere around 50,000 nests per year. The green turtle story is slightly different. These are also threatened species, not quite as numerous as loggerheads, but certainly becoming more so over time. These are the one species to exhibit this really distinct biannual nesting pattern, so a low year followed by a high year, and so forth. The high years seem to be getting higher, and even our low year last year was pretty high. So overall, this has been an exponential increase, and we can attribute some of this to conservation actions that were taken 30 years ago, potentially, and some work we've done with the Endangered Species Act, building beaches by beach nourishment, increasing the amount of habitat that's available, and just reducing threats in general. Finally, we have the leatherback sea turtle, which is considered endangered still in this part of the world. It is also nesting in, there's much fewer numbers of leatherbacks nesting in Florida. There's 700 here on the y-axis compared to loggerheads, remember, with 70,000. But again, this has been a positive trend, so that's a good thing. We saw a bit of a decline in 2014 where nests started to drop. Thankfully, though, that's turned around, and as you can see in 2020, we had a good year, and we hope that that positive trend increases. So I guess the overall picture is that turtles are doing pretty well in Florida, and that is certainly testament to our conservation actions, but it doesn't mean our job is done. We still have work to do. And that's because there are still a lot of threats to turtles, both on land and at sea. The primary ones being predation. So predators can include natural or introduced species, or poaching by humans. We have impacts in the ocean as fisheries, bycatch, or incidental capture in any kind of fishery. And then, of course, we have habitat degradation or modification or loss related to coastal development. And of course, the next question is, how do we handle this? And I think we all have to recognize that modern beaches are managed beaches. They're really no longer natural systems completely. And so it's our job as coastal managers to appropriately balance our actions to meet the needs of the ecosystem. We know that the coastal system is extremely complex, and there is a lot of biodiversity, both plant and animal. But what do we need to do to focus on, or what do we need to focus on to ensure that turtle populations are not impacted by humans? I think that we need to focus on making sure that the habitat is suitable for nesting turtles and for hatchlings. And the way that we can do this is by paying attention to the types of beaches we build. Remember, I showed you that diagram in the second slide with the slope and the width of the berm. If we can adjust our nourishment template to reduce impacts to turtles, that's a good thing. And then also reducing artificial light trespass onto the beach. One way of doing this, of course, is to simply turn the lights off, but we know that that is not that easy. and enforcing lighting ordinances can be extremely costly and complicated. So we have to ensure that we have a healthy dune system that not only functions in protecting upland areas and providing habitat for a broad range of species, but we need one that also acts as a silhouette to give turtles that critical cue that they need to orient properly off the beach. So I think it's clear that coastal biodiversity enhancement and sea turtle management must go hand in hand, and that any comprehensive coastal management program has to include a coastal lighting management program as well. Thanks.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nikki. Rob, are you able to get your presentation shared with us? And while he's doing that, I'll just give a reminder too, if you have any questions that you think of while people are presenting, feel free to not wait until the end. You're welcome to type those in now and we'll address them during the Q&A, but you can also ask.
Rob, you need to unmute as well.
Okay, hear me now?
Yes, that part we've got.
All right, now man, I had it, and where did it go? Okay, full screen. Okay, what I'm going to present here is a condensation of a program that talks about a lot of these things, but specifically orienting towards the plant management component of it.
We don't see it yet.
Oh, you don't? Well, let's see. Hold on. How do I? Okay, come on, get out of the way.
There we go.
Okay, let's go back to. All right, how about that?
Yep, looks great, thanks.
Full screen, okay. The basic tenets on there's again this is a condensation of a much larger slide presentation, so these may not follow completely logically, but the main thing I have to talk about is that seagrape is a fast-growing, shallow-rooted and brittle wood which fares poorly in a storm. The tree forms uproot and break apart, delivering damaging missiles to the wind. This was after Hurricane Andrew. There was a study done on the ground and by aerial surveys by the University of Florida that described seagrape as the worst tree in its ability to withstand hurricane force winds. This was literally a single family home sized pile of seagrape trees that had been bulldozed out of the parking lots in Crandon Park. It's very shallow rooted. If you see the brown portion near the top, that's the roots of seagrapes in a basement cut for a new home development in an unimpacted dune. And below that, seagrapes primarily in the top foot of soil. Below that, the roots of palmettos extending down 2 to 3 feet into the sand. If you don't control seagrapes, it's highly invasive. It overshadows and kills other components of the dune system. We have ways that we can measure that. The slide that George showed of the rock at Delray Beach with no beach at all, in 1972, the beach was renourished, and within a few years, they put in small clusters of seagrape about the size of a Honda Civic at the entrance points. They did not grow for 5 years until we installed sea oats later on. but that gave us a reference. If you look at this particular slide, the red circles were the original footprints approximately of the sea grapes installed around 1980. By the time we did our first management project permitted through the DEP in 2001, they expanded to the limits of the yellow lines. And in the most recent projects that we did, 2015 through 2017, the sea grapes had expanded to the footprint of the white. So we were able to measure this out, and we find that, at least on this project, the expansion is about 7% a year, which means that when they're not managed, that a sea grape stand will double in footprint within 8 to 9 years. Back to that slide in Delray, once the sea oats were installed and the sea grapes started to take off in about 1986, it only took 14 years for them to reach this height, and the entire length, the entire mile-plus shoreline of Delray Beach was, the entire view of the water was obstructed, and the trees were 15 to 25 feet high. This is an example of, they call it a deliquescent, almost liquid growth form of sea grapes. The original tree on this property, this was, again, a newly developed development property. So we had a chance to do a transect look at it. This original tree over here would reach for light, sand blow up, it would get rooted in, and it would reach for light. And from the original tree out to the seaward limit was something like 47 feet. It's a very phototropic plant. A branch of sea grapes will find some open light and start growing in that direction. So you end up trees that don't have anything like a central leader. And when we've done pruning projects, we find that underneath the foot, you can see the footprint where all the leaves are still remnant, but underneath that footprint, you have big areas where there's nothing rooted, and the canopy is overshadowing and killing the more deeply rooted pioneer zone vegetation. This is a particular site that I visited as early as the late 70s, when one could still walk from the roadway to the waterfront with your head over the tops of the palmettos. The strand was still intact, but in the absence of any kind of management, the remnant sea grapes, or the original sea grapes, overshadowed and killed off almost everything else. So what you end up with sometimes, when woody vegetation will overwhelm the natural system, is a complete change in the character of the system. The natural character is lost. And that's happened in many areas of Palm Beach County, where the only thing is left after as short a period of 25 years, the only thing that is left is overshadowing sea grapes. So the primary incentive to do a lot of these projects is obviously people want to see the water. But a deeper conservation objective is to manage the sea grapes in a way that's in the context of a complete habitat restoration, and using Society for Ecological Restoration concepts to try and model your restoration after existing wild dune areas. Sea grape can be heavily pruned in the context of a comprehensive program of habitat management and landscaping. And it can be done, it's done with our projects, always done with a reduction in turtle nesting light pollution. Oftentimes homeowners, in order to, the DEP, the Florida DEP is required by law to ensure that no pruning project, which they permit, will result in any additional lighting contaminating the beach. So every project that we do, we have to address the lighting first. Sometimes homeowners will spend thousands and thousands of dollars fixing errant lighting in order to be able to move forward with the overall dune management plan. Sea grape can be very aggressively cut. This is an example of what's called coppicing, taking tall trees down to the root collar. And we, regardless of when we do this, what time of the year, we've never had any mortality. That eventually, within usually 2 to 3 months, the plants will leaf out and fill in. Our projects are designed, this is one of the early permits from Delray Beach, but you can see that they're designed to take down the canopy, to reduce it to shrub height, to remove exotic plants, to restore the pioneer zone, and then to add as complete a mix as possible of native species to restore the original habitat. Whenever we do these projects, there's an initial public pushback, and in the day of Facebook, it can get pretty aggressive. But in the end, the science holds up. What we were doing here has been thoroughly reviewed by the regulatory agencies and other components of the scientific community. So while controversial, we're doing the right thing here. This is the most recent project that we did in Delray Beach in 2017. We had a couple of hundred screaming Facebook opinions, but again, in the bottom line is the science is correct. Delray Beach we've been managing this project for 35 years, and I think George stated that there's now over 110 species in this system, and we've only installed about 60. So once you start healing it, and if you do it correctly, it will restore itself to a certain extent. We always have to do lighting surveys. This particular shot is an example of what we shoot at night in order to confirm to the state that we have corrected the lighting issues. It's just something that we automatically do. And over the course of the years, I've done something more than 200 projects and not had any subsequent cited mortality of sea turtles. So what are the costs? Delray Beach was spending about $15,000 each event 3 times a year to prune a 30-foot wide strip, 6,840 feet long. The methods are with lopping shears, machetes. A brush cutter is a spinning blade that's very fast and aggressive, but also very dangerous. We prefer to just do the work often enough that you can use a machete, always cutting new growth. George showed you this slide. This was Sloan's Curve, the first of these projects. It's been maintained since 1990 at 42 inches, and without any significant negative consequence. Oh, what's the cost of not pruning? Delray, this particular project suffered a two-year period in which the program was discontinued, and in that 2 years, there was 6 to 9 feet of growth from the maintenance height. And when the city decided to go back to it, the cost of pruning it again was 3 to 4 times the cost of maintaining it consistently. This is another place where a condo board changed and they didn't prune for 6 months and it grew 5 feet. So if you're going to do this, you need to keep on top of it. It gives you an idea of how aggressively the plants can grow. I say look for the guy in the mask. This we're measuring growth on that particular project at 9.5 feet after 2 years without pruning, which it was originally had been maintained for years at 3 feet. Essentially, if you don't stay on top of it, it doubles the cost within a year to two-year period. In 1994, Palm Beach County Environmental Resources Management commissioned an ad hoc committee of their own people, some certified arborists, including Mike Zimmerman, who's here, native plant nurserymen, myself and the county extension agent. And after several meetings and studying all the science, the recommendation of that committee is when we're going to do this seagrape pruning to manage the dunes, it should be done at the root collar. It's a principle called coppicing. Very aggressive, but this is what we think in those of us who manage this stuff, this is the way we think it should be done. So some of the plants that you would install to restore the system: golden creeper, blackbead, both of them largely extirpated in Palm Beach County, but discoverable and easy to grow back in the nursery. So we're restoring these, as many as 50 to 60 other species in the system. Most of the coastal dune shrubs and native shrubs, having evolved in an area where they're high wind and high salt spray, tend to be very shearable. So if you choose, you can use the right plant in the dune in a very formal environment and grow them in a very landscapey way, but still they're the correct plants for the ecosystem. picture speaks for itself. This is everything that you see seaward of the palm trees right in front of the buildings is artificial man-made strand system and coastal pioneer zone. Our native plant industry, there's at least 60 species which we grow and which are marketable. What we found is there's really no weakness in any of the coastal plants that are rare and endangered. It's just habitat loss. So there's no reason why we can't restore the entire ecosystem if we choose to do so. That's my presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. Next up, we have Jimmy. And I see the questions coming through. This is great, thank you. We will address these in just a few minutes.
Jimmy, are you on mute?
I am. Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to figure out what was going on with my slides. So, hey everyone, I know we're running short on time, so I'll try and do this really quickly. What I'm going to discuss today is, a lot of what we've been talking about and how it relates to one specific endangered plant that I've been working with in the system. So I'm going to talk about keeping this open mind to beech cluster vine and how it relates to everything that we're discussing today. Come on. If the slides will advance. Okay, so Jacqueminea reclinata, also known as the beech cluster vine. It's a trailing perennial vine in the morning glory family. And it's endemic to open coastal strand habitats on barriers in Southeast Florida. So this plant is the only place between Jupiter and Miami-Dade on these barrier islands. And I want to stress that this species is, really thrives in this open coastal strand and not, coastal strand, as George discussed, we think of as this kind of shrub-dominated community, but there's kind of this open herbaceous component that exists within that in a very kind of dynamic sense. So this species was listed by the federal government in 1993 due to drastic habitat loss. I just want to show here, despite the herbaceous look of the plant, it has a really woody taproot and a woody system that's fairly long-lived. We've seen. So some of the factors contributing to the decline of this species, obviously the habitat loss, like we've discussed, habitat alterations. Also, this species historically has shown very low recruitment in the field, though we're learning more about that through the work we're doing. It seems to be, relatively competitively inferior to a lot of other species, both native and non-native. Again, as these habitats kind of fill in, and it's particularly susceptible to hardwood encroachment, and effects of fire suppression. So this is similar to maps we looked at earlier. This is a map of kind of Boca Raton, the beaches, where the strand was very, very contiguous, 100 years ago. And so just some of the work we've done with the species. Let me just move my face so I can see the screen a little better. So when we started in 2001, it was with funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Agriculture. There was just a handful of populations at the time, and there had been a number of documented extirpations. And it kind of noticed that a lot of the habitats that were present were in decline. So we started mapping and monitoring populations, researching the biology and habitat needs, and conducting experimental translocations or reintroductions, augmentations, that kind of thing. So between 2001 and 2014, we had a lot of successes. We more than doubled the total population size and nearly tripled the total number of populations. But despite all of this successes that we, individual populations, continue to be threatened by encroachment. And I'll focus right here in the center, if you can see my cursor. This is the city of Boca Raton, and I'm just going to focus on this today because these are the populations that are most impacted by seagrape in particular, despite there being a number of species that kind of impact this species. So, this was the stronghold, the largest populations that were around, hundreds of individuals, reproductive adults in 2001. And in 2014, we were down to just over 50 plants, with one population being totally extirpated. And today, I need to complete the surveys, but I think we're down to about a dozen individuals. So we're really seeing drastic declines. So we've, some of the research over the years, we have a lot of anecdotal information and things we've observed, but also through experiments, we found that shade reduces the root biomass of the plant, and they really don't like shade. And survival of Jackmannia is positively correlated with low salt concentration. So they don't like being too close to the shore on the floor dune. And they like diverse communities of graminoids and forbs. So kind of what's good for Jackmannia is good for a lot of other species too. We found that the species can form a persistent seed bank. And it's also quite easy to grow. So, there's a lot of opportunities to work with the species. And so just as an example of what some of the changes we're talking about, we looked at some other photos earlier. This is a view of, looking north in the area of South Beach near Palmetto Park Road around the 1920s. When it was much more open, so we'd have a lot of this open coastal strand, in the back dune area here, which is now almost completely shrubs, and even the areas that are somewhat open are kind of dominated by dense grasses like beach panicum. This is just an example of, this was the largest patch of Jackmannia, as recently as 15 years ago. We had 70 individuals here as open and thriving, and currently just really closing in with seagrapes. And it was nice to see some of Rob's data, because I don't have a lot of data on this, but I also found some data from Blowing Rocks and Nature Conservancy at Micarenda, where they were showing this increase in cover of nearly tripling in coverage in just a few years, 5 to 6 years. So, and I just want to stress that, it's not just seagrape. We're dealing with, obviously I don't even feel like I need to talk about invasive species. We all know the threat of invasive species, but there's not, a number of other native species like knickerbean, coin vine, things like that, that can be an issue. But I worry about seagrape in particular because it grows so fast and creates such unique conditions just by being so tall and creating so much leaf litter. And it really creates this feedback loop where the more shade we have and the more leaf litter, you get more soil moisture. So even where we still have these open habitats where Jackmannia and other plants are hanging on, the conditions there are fundamentally changing. And a lot of other plants in the area are, just other herbaceous species are increasing in their biomass drastically. And it's really just this cycle that, we're trying to get a hold of. But what we found through restoration work that we've been doing is that if we provide the conditions of high light and low soil moisture, this organic matter in the soil will actually oxidize pretty quickly, and that the seed banks of a lot of these native coastal species are resilient. So we found if we remove the biomass, if we're not just, spraying and trimming, if we really make sure to get a lot of the biomass out of there in the leaf litter, that these plant communities really respond well. So there's a lot of hope in the work that we're doing. So I just want to show you some examples, and again, this isn't seagrape, but this is kind of had restoration successes. So we've been working with seagrape in Boca Raton, but we're still, this is just a few weeks into the restoration, and we're kind of haven't seen some of the plant communities come back. It takes a little bit of time, but here's an example from Virginia Key and Miami-Dade. There was once a thriving Jackmannia population under here, and over the years kind of just filled in with hardwoods like white stopper and pigeon plum, wild lime, a number of things. And we went in with a group of volunteers from FIU just really trimmed everything back, and we came back about 6 weeks later. Plants are thriving, other forbs and grasses, seeing recruitment. You know, I mentioned that recruitment's really low in the wild, but when we've been creating these disturbances, we actually documented 18 new seedlings in this population, which is the most that had been documented in any of our monitoring events. You know, so we're seeing a really positive response to these restoration projects, which, you know, there was some concern about too much disturbance might just bring in weeds, and plants are very resilient. Here's another example from the same site. I mentioned coin vine earlier. Coin vine is a very fast growing woody vine that kind of scrambles all over vegetation. We removed it with volunteers. Not only did Jacquemontia explode, but so did devil's potato, Achites umbellata, and you can see beech peanut in the foreground here. So we're really excited about just the successes we're having with pretty small scale restoration work. Crandon Park, nearby, we're dealing with a different suite of species. It's Metopium and Pithecolobium. Again, diversity that we want in these systems, but as you can see from this picture, you know, through fire suppression and just over time, these areas can just become very dense and fill in. But we're finding with, you know, a couple days a year, we can really create the conditions that we need for our herbaceous community. And I'm just gonna basically end with this from Ezel Eula Johnson State Park, you know, formerly John Lloyd. This is back in 2005. They had a pretty major invasive species removal initiative, and they removed a large stand of Australian pine. And this was in 2005, and then in 2009, they were out kind of retreating the area, and you can see all these flags. They just found an explosion of Jacquemontia. So just speaking to the resilience of this species, you know, years under Australian pine and kind of, you know, the allelopathic properties of that species open up the habitat, and you know, a lot of the plants will come back. So on that, there's a lot of opportunities for restoration. You know, if folks are interested in removing Seagrape, there's, you know, a lot of other things we can do on a more fine scale to really increase the diversity of, you know, not just this federally listed plant, but, you know, the other, you know, low growing forbs and grasses that grow in these open areas with it. You know, so what I do, you know, I encourage land managers to think, you know, beyond just coastal strand, which that's a start in and of itself. But some species, you know, we also need to see this kind of, you know, micro habitat diversity within that if we really want to maximize diversities at these sites. So I encourage land managers to include some plan for open patches. And it really just starts by creating those open conditions, and the sooner we do it, the better. And we found that after these initial efforts of getting kind of woody biomass down, that a single day a year, a small work day with a small group can really maintain this diversity. So I think there's a lot of hope through partnership with other land managers. So I think there's a lot of good things to come. I just want to thank George and Rob and Niki and everyone for putting this together, and Cara.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jimmy.
Yeah.
All right, so that concludes the presentation part, and we are at 1. We're not as late as I thought we could have been coming from all of this. So let me grab a few of the questions that I see have already come through. If you have other questions, feel free to put those in now. And like I said, you can address it to a specific person or just openly. And we also understand if you're on a time crunch and can't stay longer, but we'll stay on maybe like the next 15 minutes if people are free, and we'll handle some of these questions. So the first one from Jamie with Surfrider, she says, what are your thoughts on replacing all sea grapes with native dune species? The idea of having city governments continuing to cater to property owners and their complaints about views when they are steps away from the ocean isn't a precedent I'm comfortable with encouraging, saying that you might be able to excuse cutting down vegetation in the future for less qualified situations. So what are your thoughts on replacing sea grapes?
All right, I'll jump in. I would say that there's two issues there, and they're distinct. One is the issue of private property owners and views, and I would say that, you know, again, going back to the SER standards, that stakeholders have to be included in the process, and private property owners have funded a huge amount of the restoration work that has been done. So what's more interesting, I think, is the other question of why are we continuing to spend money trimming a tree that we know has expanded its footprint tenfold in the last 20 years, that is super expensive to do. And even the private property owners, like if you went to Sloan's Curve and said, hey, let's rip out all the sea grapes or cut it or whatever DEP lets us do and replace it with things that don't need to be trimmed every 3 times a year, other native species, increase biodiversity, what would be the ultimate economic consequence of that? And I think that would be worth looking at. Same thing with Delray Beach. I mean, do we want to continue to spend this money? Can we replace some of the footprint of Seagrape with other species that don't need to be trimmed 3 times a year? And I think that that's a really interesting question. Is this a good use of our resources? You know, the issue of ecosystem management or restoration and trimming, again, we go to the issue of fire. Fire played a very particular and important role in these systems, and fire would burn these things back. If we don't have fire, then fire surrogate activities are things that we have to consider. But I think that the idea of not just spending good money after bad should be considered, and we could look at that on a small scale.
And I have to pipe in too. I can say with high level of confidence that some of the most sophisticated habitat jobs that we have done have been initiated by a private owner who wanted to restore a view that was lost because of what many of us consider arbitrary regulation that did not, when it was initiated, the regulation did not really understand habitat management principles like this.
And could I cycle off of this question and ask if there's a way that we could replace sea grapes with other native plants that would maybe still help with the lighting issue that we have for sea turtles?
I can answer once again. Anytime you undertake a project of this nature, you've got to get a permit from the DEP. And by law, the DEP is requires you to prove before you start your planting work that you have solved, not minimized, but you have solved the essential lighting problem. So many, many thousands of dollars are invested by private owners who want to work on the view, but end up fixing the lights. And we are doing any number of small, medium scale projects where the DEP is now allowing us, once we demonstrate through historical aerial photographs and such, we demonstrate the extent and the speed of the expansion of the Seagrape canopy. The DEP is now allowing us to go back and renovate, I think is the correct word.
Awesome.
Cara, I was wondering if we could, not to put you on the spot, Mike, but since you're here, I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add to the conversation. Mike Zimmerman?
Okay, well, our big push has been the Seagrape pruning for the city of Delray, and quite frankly, we just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we're just fighting a losing battle, I feel, by going to this arbitrary 42-inch cut. Because the sea grapes grow so fast, and we find now we have sea grapes where we didn't even have sea grapes before. So I'm a proponent of at least getting it down to the root collar and minimizing it and allowing these other plants to grow in. So I'm all for what everybody's talked about in terms of other species to have the diversity in the beach area. Nobody's really talked about trapping sand. And that's the other thing that has been so incredible in the city of Delray, is the trapping of the sand as we do reduce the sea grapes. And I think that in the long run, we should be talking about that as well, and having less problems with erosion at the beach front because we're not trapping the sand. So I think there's a lot more work that we could be doing with sea grape reduction and removal, and I'm all for other plant material being brought in. The outcry, unfortunately, when we go to these local areas like the city of Delray, is the lack of information that the public has of why we're doing this and what's going on and so forth. And the last time we were there, which is just a few months ago, where we took on a part of the beach that hadn't been addressed before, the outcry was unbelievable. Facebook had lots and lots of comments about how we're destroying the beach and what we're doing there and so forth. So I think programs like what you're doing right now and public relations through the cities and communities is really important, so that the information gets put out that what we're trying to accomplish is going to be beneficial in the long run. And, you know, like you all have talked about, it's not even the long run. Some of it's pretty dramatic in a short period of time. Thank you all for your information and knowledge of what we're trying to get across. And I really appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
And related to what you just talked about, we had a question come through. It says, can you share studies about increased trapping of the sand once sea grape have been removed? Is there data available?
I'm not aware of any. And in fact, most of the sand trapping that occurs is in the frontal dune, in those areas, those are herbaceous areas. You know, you can see in Delray Beach along the front dune where there's been as much as 13 vertical feet of sand accretion. And it happens predominantly in those grassy areas. You know, another reason to continue to contain the encroachment of the sea grape canopy into those grassy areas. We also know that the root mass of sea oats and pioneer zone species is deeper and much more dense than that underneath the sea grape canopy. But I don't know. I think you could derive that data from existing topographical surveys, which are mandated from, for all the Nourishment Project, but I don't know that anybody's published it.
Just to follow up on this topic, this is our first run at this in terms of stakeholder engagement and communication, providing information, et cetera. So as we're going through this process, we're collecting these kinds of questions. And in this case, we can do a literature review. We'll see what's out there. If the literature is not there, we can recommend small scale trials and experiments where actual measurements can be taken so that we can move forward with, defensible evidence-based data. So we're happy to have these questions. We're not going to have all the answers. We don't pretend to, but this can move us in the right direction so that as a community, that we can get the information that we need to make the best decisions.
Great. And somebody had asked, what is coppicing? And I think that's what you were just talking about with cutting down to the root cap. Is that what you were saying? Collar, thank you. And then this is an interesting question. How much of the habitat modification can be explained by climate change? And this came up while Jimmy was talking, but I feel like it could apply too.
Yeah, so climate change, like sea turtle lights, is a highly complicated thing that's going to be hard to tease out. However, there's two issues here. One is, are plants growing faster so there's the issue of growth rates, more carbon in the atmosphere, warmer temperatures, and so that probably is having an influence on sea grapes and other vegetation like knicker bean and coin vine and other things that we're seeing kind of exploding in the system. So yeah, sure, that's probably happening. Does anybody have measurements of that? I don't think so, but we'll also put that on our list of things to investigate. However, again, I will cycle back to fire. And the role of fire in grassy and shrubby ecosystems in Florida is hugely important and very well documented. Less so on the barrier islands, but indigenous people lived on the barrier islands for thousands of years. It's well documented to have used fire to create ecosystem mosaics that were beneficial to them. So even as sea grapes were growing more quickly, if we had fire in the system, then it would combat a lot of the climate change effects. Freezing temperatures alone or wind alone would not have affected sea grapes 100 meters into the interior of some of these really big strands. Fire was a hugely important role. So I think I caution everyone to say, well, this is a fundamental permanent change caused by climate, and the system is going to go to some sort of sea grape forest. That makes no sense. That would be like saying all the music flatwoods in Florida should become live oak forest. Fire is part of the system. Let's figure out what we need to do if we're not going to use that particular tool. And Jimmy Lange and I worked on a project. I had a very minor role. He had a very major role, looking at woody encroachment on grasslands on Cape Sable in Everglades National Park, which was widely populated by indigenous people for thousands of years as well. And the Park Service used to do prescribed burning there for a long while and stopped. And Jimmy and his team at Fairchild and FIU and others documented a huge increase in woody vegetation in response to the lack of fire. So Niki's point is right. This is a managed system. The decisions we make are important. Climate change is important, but it doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say everything is different, so we're just going to give up.
I just want to add, George, that when that Palm Beach County ad hoc committee was studying this, we looked at cold and the frequency of freezing, and certainly you can observe whenever you get a freeze that it basically takes sea grape down to the ground and releases the palmettos and many of the other. And that combined with the fact that you don't find any substantial sea grape stands north of Daytona where they're still continuing to get freeze. But I did a presentation about climate change and population dynamics on the dune, and the other thing that we concluded is that it's probably less the impact along the shoreline, less the impact of overall climate change and warming than it is the impact of urbanization and creating what they call the urban heat island. If you go back 100 years, if you go back to the 1920s and 30s, you'd get a freeze that would only last a day or two, but it froze. And if you go back to 1925, there was a 3-day hard freeze in Miami, and it was a 5-day hard freeze in Delray Beach. So but once you start paving and building all this massive stuff that holds heat, that Yankee Clipper storm that's going to blow and maybe get down to 29 degrees for 24 hours doesn't get below freezing. And so the warming effect of all the pavement right along the shoreline might be just enough to tip the balance to where things that used to be a control are no longer a control.
Great. So we are at 1:15, and to be respectful of people's time, I think we should wrap this up for today. I'm about to put my email in the group chat. Feel free to follow up if you have other questions or thoughts after this. I'd be happy to relay, those questions around. And hopefully this is just the start of a conversation that we can continue to have. So this is recorded. We'll get it posted on YouTube and available for sharing after this. And we would appreciate any feedback too. So on my email that I'm about to put out, feel free to send that along as well. We appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you so much.